Lecture 3, nominal and real GDP. We're going to be talking about two different ways to calculate GDP. And I hesitate to say calculate because we've already calculated GDP in terms of the components of GDP. But now we're going to look at different ways of measuring GDP in terms of its market value. So how do we determine that market value of the items in GDP? All right, so when we're thinking about nominal and real GDP, the two different types of GDP, inflation can distort economic variables like GDP. So whenever we value things at their market value, what we're going to see is that as prices naturally rise due to inflation, it's going to inflate GDP. So we know that the price of everything that we purchase has gone up over time. And so we could think about specific examples, things like candy bars, grocery items. You often hear people say that you see prices going up but not wages. And what they're referring to is that inflation, the cost of living. And so if prices are going up, what we're going to see is that GDP is also going to increase because those items are included in their basket. They're included at their market value. And so inflation is going to distort GDP. And so we have two different versions of GDP, one that's going to allow us to correct for inflation and the other going to use current prices. Nominal GDP values our output, values our GDP using current prices. And so we say this is not corrected for inflation. What we mean by this is we're using today's prices. And so when we compare over time, we compare with the prices at that date. So if we were comparing 2001 to today, then we would use 2001 prices when calculating GDP in 2001, and then today's prices to calculate GDP today. But what it's best for is making comparisons across countries. So remember, we want to make those comparisons in the standard of living across countries, or if we want to understand the current value of output. So if we want to understand what the current or what the present value of the output looks like, or what production looked like to the individuals living during that current period, we would use nominal GDP. Our next indicator, real GDP, is going to be corrected for inflation. And it's corrected for inflation because we use a constant set of prices in a base year. So again, if we were comparing today to 2001, and we said 2001 is this base year, then we would use 2001 prices to calculate GDP in 2001, but we'd also use 2001 prices today. And what that allows us to do then is make comparisons over time. So when we think about how does GDP change over time, well, we want to look at how production in the United States has changed over time. How is the average income? How is the average spending changed? But we don't want to think about it in changes in the prices. We only want to change it in terms of the output or the quantities that are bought and sold in the market. And so to do that, we use the base year. So let's go through an example of calculating real and nominal GDP. So let's go through nominal. And again, we're going to use current prices and then think about that in relation to the current quantities. So if I said we were going to calculate GDP in 2015, we take the price of pizza, and we're going to assume only two goods here. So these are the two goods. We know that GDP includes all of those components, the C, the plus I, plus G, plus those net exports, and I might have, I think actually in the textbook, it's XN, but we add all those components up. We're just going to assume that our economy only produces and consumes two goods. And so we're going to simplify this equation into just pizza and lattes. And so again, each good is valued at their market value. And so pizza costs $10 in 2015 and a latte costs $2. And so what we do is we take $10 times that 400. So $10 per pizza times the 400 pizzas will give us the market value of all pizza produced within the borders of this nation this year. And then here we have the lattes. We have $2 times 1,000. This gives us a total of $6,000. So GDP this year, or in 2015, was $6,000. And then we can move on to 2016. And when we're calculating nominal GDP, we use the current prices for that year. And so we're talking about $11 for a pizza and 500 pizzas bought and sold. Okay, so what we can see here is that the price between 2015 and 2016 has gone up. And so while it's not only we're not only becoming more productive because we're producing and consuming more pizzas, but those pizzas just got more expensive. And so GDP is going up first because there's a change in price, and second because there's a change in quantity. All right, then the price of a latte also went up 50 cents. And so price of latte goes up to $2.50, which we can see there. And then we sell now, buy and sell, buy and produce 1,100 lattes. So the quantity has also gone up again. So GDP increasing to 8,250, partly because our prices have increased, and then partly because our quantities have increased. All right, and then in 2017, we're going to use those 2017 prices, so $12 and $3, and we're going to multiply them by their respective quantities, 600 and 1,200. And so again, we see that the prices between 2016 and 2017 have gone up, and so part of that increase in GDP is going to be due to price increase, and part of it's going to be due to quantity increase. And so when we calculate our GDP, we get 10,800. Okay, so these are the nominal GDPs. Now we're going to calculate real GDP, and real GDP is going to use a base year, and we're going to use 2015 as that base year. So the prices are going to stay the same the whole way through. So you can just list your prices of $10 for all 3 years, list your prices of $2 for all 3 years, and we're not going to change those prices. So in 2015, what we're going to see in the base year, when we're in the base year, nominal and real GDP are equal. So nominal and real GDP are equal. And this is because the nominal is the current prices, while the current prices are the base year prices. And so 2015, again, has $6,000 as their real level of GDP. Okay, so now though we're moving to 2016, but what we're moving is only quantity. I see too often on quizzes and exams where students move prices and don't move quantity. What we want to know is about the production of the United States, so always move quantity along. So we're going to take 10 times 500, 2 times 1,100, and that's going to give us a real GDP of 7,200. We can see that this is less than our previous example of 8,250. And the reason why it's less is because we don't see the price change. So in this case, so before we had our price go from $10 to $11 and $2 to $2.50. What we see here is there's only the quantity change. So when we're thinking about real GDP only measures the changes in quantity, whereas nominal GDP is going to measure both price changes and quantity changes. All right, then when we move to 2017, again, we're going to use base year prices, so $10 and $2 stays exactly the same. Then we use the current year's quantities, so 600 and 1,200. So 10 times 600, 2 times 1,200, and again, we see that this number, this real level of GDP, is less than the nominal. So nominal was 10,000 something, and then now we have a real level of 8,400. And the reason for that is because, again, we're not measuring that change in price. We're only measuring that change in quantity. Those are the only changes. Those price changes don't exist when we're thinking about real GDP. All right, so nominal GDP is using the current prices for the given year. So the change in nominal GDP reflects both changes to prices and changes to output. Real GDP is measured using that constant prices for the base year. So the base year will always be given to you. That's a must. If you have to calculate real GDP, you must know the base year. And so prices are going to be constant, only using that base year. And so the changes in real GDP are only going to include changes to output. So it's going to depend if, so I often hear, is nominal GDP always going to be larger than real GDP? And it might not be the case. And we're going to look at exactly, we're going to look at an instance where it is, but we're going to talk about an instance where it might not be. Okay, so what we say, since nominal GDP does account for price changes, but real GDP doesn't, they only look at changes in output, we say that real GDP is corrected for inflation. It ignores inflation. So make sure that you recognize that as you're measuring and thinking about nominal and real GDP. We want to forget about any changes in prices. We're correcting real GDP for inflation. All right, so let's go through a quick quiz. I want you to pause me now and calculate nominal and real GDP using 2001 as a base year. But before you do that, I want you to look at the quantities produced. So pizza in this economy has gone from, in 2001, they were producing 400 units, and in 2002, they only produced 300 units. And then what about the lattes? Well, they also dropped the production of lattes by 200. And so we might say that this economy is in a recession, or it's definitely in a downturn because production has fallen. But let's see what our GDP numbers tell us. So pause now and calculate nominal and real GDP. All right, so hopefully you've calculated nominal and real GDP. And so what we're going to see first, we're going to look at nominal GDP in 2001. And with nominal GDP, we don't have to worry about a base year. We just use current prices and current quantities. So we're going to take 10, a price of 10 times 400 pizzas sold. And we're going to add that to the $2 price of a latte times 1,000 lattes. And when we do so, we get $6,000. Our GDP in 2001 is 6,000. All right, and then what about nominal in 2002? Well, again, we're going to use our current prices and our current quantities. So 20 times 300 plus $5 times 800. And when we calculate this, we see that we have GDP equal to 10,000. So even though our economy is producing less, right, production has gone down in both the production of pizzas and the production of lattes. So we're producing less, but our nominal real GDP makes it look like our economy is improving. It makes it look like we're increasing production from 6,000 to 10,000. But we know that's not the case. So let's see what happens with real. And so with real GDP, we have to use 2001 as a base year. And so that's a very important piece, and it's going to be what we're going, I'm going to have to tell you that anytime you have to calculate real GDP. And so we're going to use $10 and $2 both for our real GDP in 2001 and our real GDP in 2002. And so let's just put those in there immediately. So 10 times, and then $2 times, and then $2. And I'm not going to go very straight there, but all right. So now we just have to fill in the quantities. Well, the quantities in 2001 are 400 and 1,000. And if you remember from previously, the nominal and the real GDP are always equal in our base year. And so we have real GDP of 6,000 once again in 2001. In 2002, we're going to use 2002 quantities. So we've already set our base year prices, and we have 300 and 800. And when we take 10 times 300 plus 2 times 800, we get 4,600. And so real GDP tells us a better picture of what's going on over time. It's telling us, well, prices went up. That's what nominal GDP was measuring. Nominal GDP, remember, takes into account, so changes in our nominal GDP is partially due to those changes in prices and partially due to those changes in quantity. Whereas real GDP only takes into account those changes in quantity. So what we experienced in our nominal GDP is we saw inflation. We saw prices of all goods in our economy go up. And even though our changes in quantity were negative, it's still that inflation, those increases in prices, still brought up nominal GDP. Nominal GDP increased between here and here. Since there's no inflation, right, we're assuming that fixed prices, we're correcting ourselves for inflation, we only get the change in quantity, and the change in quantity was falling over this time period, and so our real GDP fell the same way that quantity did. All right. And so what we're going to find is that typically that nominal GDP measure is going to be greater than real GDP. And this is going to be true for the great majority of history within the United States. There could be the case where we would have a period of deflation or something like that that might cause our nominal GDP to actually be less than our real GDP. But again, that's very rare, especially in our current economic times. All right, so as you continue on with GDP, make sure before you go on, if you have any questions calculating real or nominal GDP, you work on those worksheets and you stop by my office hours.